In the endless expanse of the Eurasian steppes, where the horizon stretches beyond the eye's reach and the wind carries whispers of ancient tales, there lived a people whose very existence seemed woven from the fabric of legend itself. The grass here grows thick and green in spring, turning golden as summer fades, and beneath these rolling hills lie the bones of empires that once shook the world. The Mongols emerged from this vast wilderness not as conquerors first, but as nomads following their herds across a landscape that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of eternity. Long before the name of Genghis Khan echoed across continents, the steppes knew the hoofbeats of countless tribes. The Mongols were but one among many, divided into clans that moved like clouds across the grasslands, their felt tents appearing and disappearing with the seasons. They lived in harmony with the harsh beauty of their land, where winter winds could freeze a man's breath, and summer storms could split the sky with lightning. Their horses were small but hardy, their bows carved from horn and sinew, their lives bound to the ancient rhythms of nomadic existence. The stories they told around their fires spoke of Bertacino, the blue wolf, and Koai Marol, the fallow doe, the mythical ancestors who had crossed the Tengri Lake to reach the land that would become their home. These tales, passed down through generations, painted a picture of a people chosen by Tengri, the eternal blue sky, to rule over all who lived beneath its dome. The shamans would speak of prophecies written in the stars, of a great leader who would unite the scattered tribes and lead them to glory that would echo through the ages. As you drift deeper into this tale, imagine the stillness of a steppe night, where the only sounds are the distant call of wolves and the gentle rustle of grass in the wind. It was in such a world that a child was born in the year 1162, clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist. The shamans declared this an omen of greatness, for blood was the symbol of strength and conquest. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently defeated, and from the moment he drew his first breath, his destiny seemed written in the very stars above. Yesugei, Temujin's father, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, neither the most powerful nor the weakest among the Mongol tribes. He had earned respect through his prowess in battle and his skill in the intricate politics of steppe life, where alliances shifted like sand, and today's friend might be tomorrow's enemy. The Mongols of this time were caught in an endless cycle of raids and counter-raids, their scattered clans unable to unite against the greater threats that surrounded them. To the south lay the Jin dynasty, the golden empire that ruled northern China from behind the Great Wall, their cities filled with silk and porcelain, their armies equipped with the finest weapons that Chinese craftsmanship could produce. To the west, the Khwarezmian Empire stretched across Persia and Central Asia, its merchants growing rich from the Silk Road trade that connected east and west. The Mongols knew of these great powers, but they seemed as distant as the stars, separated by vast distances and the Mongols' own disunity. The boy Temujin grew up in a world where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to read the intentions of others. When he was 9 years old, his father took him to the Ongirat tribe to arrange his betrothal to Berthe, a girl of remarkable beauty and intelligence. The match was politically astute, designed to strengthen ties between the clans, but as Yesugei rode home through the Tatar lands, he was invited to feast with men he took to be friends. The Tatars, remembering old grudges, poisoned his food, and the great chieftain died in agony, his body racked with pain as the toxins coursed through his veins. News of Yesugei's death spread across the steppes like wildfire, and with it came the dissolution of his clan's unity. The Taichud, Former allies who had chafed under Yesugei's leadership seized the opportunity to claim dominance. They drove Temujin's family from their lands, leaving them to wander the steppes as outcasts. Their herds scattered, their followers departed. Hoelun, Temujin's mother, gathered her children around her and spoke words that would echo through history. "We have no friends but our shadows, no whips but our horses' tails." The years of exile tested Temujin's character in ways that would forge him into the leader history would remember. With his younger brothers, Kasar, Kachiun, and Temuge, and his half-brothers Bekta and Belgotai, he learned to survive on the margins of Mongol society. They ate roots and berries when meat was scarce, caught fish with their bare hands, and learned to move silently through the tall grass to avoid their enemies. It was during these harsh years that Temujin developed the iron will and ruthless pragmatism that would later characterize his rule. The most defining moment of his youth came when tensions with his half-brother Bekta reached a breaking point. Bekta, older and stronger, had begun asserting dominance over the family's meager resources, taking the best portions of their catches and treating Temujin with open contempt. The breaking point came when Bekta seized a fish and a lark that Temujin and Kasar had caught, claiming them by right of his seniority. That night, as the steppes lay silent under the star-filled sky, Temujin and Kasar stalked Bekta through the grass and killed him with arrows to the back. When they returned to their mother with news of what they had done, Hoelun's rage was terrible to behold. She accused them of being destroyers of their own kind, comparing them to fierce beasts that devour their own cubs. Yet even in her anger, she recognized the cold calculation that had driven her son's actions. Temujin had eliminated a rival and demonstrated to his remaining brothers that he would not tolerate challenges to his authority. It was a lesson in power that would serve him well in the years to come. As the night continues and your breathing grows steady, let your mind wander to those vast grasslands where a young man was learning the harsh lessons of leadership. The Taichiud, learning of Temujin's growing reputation, decided to capture him before he could gather followers. They surprised him at dawn, slipping a wooden collar around his neck and parading him through their camps as a trophy. For months, he endured this humiliation, but his captors underestimated both his patience and his cunning. During the festival of the new moon, when the Taichiud had drunk deeply of fermented mare's milk and their vigilance was low, Temujin made his escape. He struck down his guard with the wooden collar still around his neck and disappeared into the night. A young man named Chilan found him hiding by a river, the collar making it impossible for him to lift his head. Rather than claim the reward offered for Temujin's capture, Chilan freed him and helped him return to his family. This act of loyalty would not be forgotten, and Chilan would later become one of Temujin's most trusted generals. The escape from the Taichiud marked the beginning of Temujin's rise to power. Word of his daring spread across the steppes, and gradually warriors began to seek him out. They were drawn not only by his reputation for courage, but by something deeper, a vision of unity that transcended the petty squabbles of clan politics. Temujin spoke of a time when the Mongols would no longer fight each other, but would turn their strength against their true enemies. His first major alliance came with Jamuka, his blood brother from childhood, who had already established himself as a powerful leader among the Mongol clans. Their reunion was celebrated with great ceremony, and they renewed their oath of brotherhood, swearing to be each other's shadow and echo. For a time, their combined strength made them formidable, but the alliance contained the seeds of its own destruction. Both men were natural leaders, and the steppes were not large enough for two such wolves to share the same territory. The relationship between Temujin and Jamuka was complex, marked by genuine affection as well as bitter rivalry. They had grown up together, shared childhood adventures, and understood each other's strengths and weaknesses better than any other living person. Yet their visions for the future of the Mongol people diverged fundamentally. Jamuka represented the traditional way of steppe politics, where power was based on noble birth and ancient clan privileges. Temujin, forged by hardship and exile, believed in meritocracy, that leadership should go to those who proved themselves worthy through deeds rather than bloodlines. The first great test of Temujin's leadership came when the Merkits, seeking revenge for an old grievance, raided his camp and kidnapped his wife, Berta. The Merkits remembered that Yasuge had once stolen a bride from their tribe, and they saw this as a fitting retribution. Berta's capture was not just a personal blow to Temujin, but a challenge to his authority as a leader. A man who could not protect his own wife would find it difficult to convince others to follow him into battle. The rescue of Berta required careful planning and powerful allies. Temujin turned to Togrul, the Wang Khan of the Karaitas, who had been his father's blood brother and owed a debt of loyalty to Yasuge's son. Togrul agreed to provide warriors, as did Jamuka, and together they launched a devastating assault on the Merkit camps. The battle was fought in the grey hours before dawn, when the mist hung low over the grasslands and the only sounds were the thunder of hooves and the clash of weapons. Berta was recovered, but she was pregnant, and the child's paternity would remain a source of uncertainty. When Yochi was born, Temujin accepted him as his son, but whispers followed the boy throughout his life. These whispers would later have profound implications for the succession of the Mongol Empire, as Yochi's questionable legitimacy would bar him from the supreme leadership despite his considerable abilities. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind rest on the image of the great steppe at dawn, where dew clings to the grass and the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions. It was in this vastness that Temujin began to build the foundations of what would become the largest contiguous empire in human history. The success of the Merkit raid had enhanced his reputation, but it had also revealed the growing tension between him and Jamuka. The breaking point came over a seemingly minor incident involving the theft of horses. Jamuka's followers had raided one of Temujin's camps, and in the ensuing conflict, Jamuka's younger brother was killed. This death, whether accidental or intentional, provided Jamuka with the justification he needed to move against his former blood brother. He gathered a great army, drawing warriors from across the eastern steppes, and sent word to Temujin that the time for reckoning had come. The Battle of Dalan Baljut was fought in 1187, and it marked the first major confrontation between the two greatest leaders of their generation. Jamuka's army was larger and better equipped, filled with warriors from the most prestigious clans. Temujin's forces were smaller, but more unified, bound together by personal loyalty rather than clan obligations. The battle raged for hours under the burning sun, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. As the day wore on, Temujin's forces began to give ground. The superior numbers of Jamuka's army were telling, and it became clear that continued resistance would mean annihilation. Temujin ordered a fighting withdrawal, his warriors covering each other as they fell back toward the mountains. The retreat was masterfully conducted, preventing Jamuka from turning a tactical victory into a strategic triumph. But it left Temujin in a precarious position. The defeat at Dalan Baljut might have ended the career of a lesser man, but Temujin used it as a learning experience. He analyzed every aspect of the battle, from the deployment of his forces to the loyalty of his followers. He realized that he needed to build a different kind of army, one based not on the traditional clan structure, but on personal bonds of loyalty and mutual benefit. He began to implement revolutionary changes in how his forces were organized and led. The traditional Mongol social structure was based on the decimal system, with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. Temujin adopted this system, but filled the leadership positions based on merit rather than birth. He promoted men who had shown courage and loyalty regardless of their clan affiliation, creating a military aristocracy that owed its position to him alone. This system would later become the foundation of the Mongol Empire's military might. During the years following his defeat, Temujin's following grew steadily. Warriors who had served under other leaders began to defect to him, drawn by his reputation for fairness and his promise that those who served him faithfully would be rewarded. He showed particular skill in winning over the followers of defeated enemies, often incorporating entire units into his own army after demonstrating his military prowess. One of the most significant additions to his force came when he encountered Subotai, a young warrior from the Uryankai clan who would later become one of the greatest generals in military history. Subotai was barely 20 when he first met Temujin, but he displayed a natural genius for warfare that the future great Khan immediately recognized. Their first meeting was said to have taken place around a campfire, where Subotai outlined a strategy for dealing with the merkits that displayed such insight that Temujin immediately elevated him to a position of trust. The integration of diverse groups into his army required Temujin to develop new systems of law and governance. The traditional Mongol approach to justice was based on clan law and blood feuds, but this would not work in a multi-tribal army. Temujin began to formulate what would later become the Yasa, the great law code of the Mongol Empire. The Yasa emphasized loyalty above all else, but it also provided protections for those who served faithfully regardless of their origins. As the night deepens and your mind grows peaceful, consider the vast steppes where Temujin was slowly building the foundations of empire. The process was not dramatic, but gradual, like grass growing after winter snow melts. Each decision, each alliance, each victory was a small step toward a goal that even Temujin himself might not have fully envisioned. The Mongol Empire was not built in a day, but grew organically from the practical needs of governing a diverse coalition of steppe peoples. The turning point in Temujin's fortunes came when the Jin dynasty, the Jurchen-ruled empire that controlled northern China, decided to intervene in steppe politics. The Jin had long pursued a policy of divide and rule, supporting different Mongol factions to prevent any single leader from becoming too powerful. When they decided to elevate Jamukha to the position of Gur Khan, or universal ruler, they inadvertently pushed many Mongol clans toward Temujin, who was seen as the natural alternative to this foreign-backed candidate. The Jin decision backfired spectacularly. Many Mongol leaders who had been neutral in the conflict between Temujin and Jamukha now saw the latter as a puppet of foreign interests. The steppes had a long tradition of independence, and the idea of a Mongol leader being appointed by the sedentary empires to the south was deeply offensive to many warriors. Temujin skillfully exploited this sentiment, presenting himself as the defender of Mongol independence against foreign interference. The defections to Temujin's cause accelerated, and by 1196, he had assembled a force large enough to challenge his rivals directly. The first major test came when Togrul, the Wang Khan of the Karaites, requested assistance against the merkits. Temujin agreed to help, seeing an opportunity to prove his military abilities and strengthen his alliance with the powerful Karaite leader. The campaign was brilliantly executed, with Temujin's forces playing a crucial role in the victory. The success against the Merkits led to Temujin's first major independent command when he was given the opportunity to lead a campaign against the Tatars. The Tatars, who had killed his father, represented both a personal enemy and a strategic threat. They controlled key grazing areas and maintained close ties with the Jin dynasty, making them natural opponents of Mongol unification. The campaign against them would test all of Temujin's skills as a military leader. The war against the Tatars was fought with a brutality that shocked even the violence-accustomed steppes. Temujin ordered that all Tatar males taller than the height of a cart axle be killed, effectively exterminating the Tatar tribe as a political entity. This decision was both strategic and personal. Strategic because it eliminated a dangerous enemy, personal because it avenged his father's death. The surviving Tatars were integrated into Mongol society, but as a distinct group, they ceased to exist. The destruction of the Tatars sent shockwaves across the steppes and established Temujin's reputation as a leader who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Some were horrified by the brutality, while others saw it as necessary for Mongol survival. The message was clear. Those who opposed Temujin faced not just defeat, but extinction, while those who submitted could find a place in his growing empire. With the Tatars eliminated, Temujin turned his attention to the remaining power centers on the steppes. The Karaites, despite their alliance, were potentially the most dangerous enemy. Togrul, the Wang Khan, was aging and his grip on power was weakening. His son Sengum was ambitious and saw Temujin as a threat to his inheritance. The Naimans, led by Tayang Khan, controlled the western steppes and had their own ambitions for dominance. The relationship between Temujin and the Karaites deteriorated gradually. Togrul was caught between his old friendship with Temujin and his son's pressure to eliminate the rising Mongol leader. The breaking point came when Sengum attempted to assassinate Temujin during a supposedly friendly meeting. The plot was discovered at the last moment, and Temujin escaped. But the betrayal ended any possibility of peaceful coexistence. The war between the Mongols and Karaites was fought in 1203 and marked a crucial turning point in the unification of the steppes. The Karaites were more numerous and better equipped, many of them having converted to Christianity and maintaining close ties with the Jin dynasty. They had access to Chinese weapons and military advisors, making them a formidable opponent. The conflict would test every aspect of Temujin's military reforms and leadership abilities. As you rest deeper into the night, let your mind wander to those moonlit battlefields where the fate of empires was decided by the clash of horsemen. The Battle of Köse-Ir-Naur was fought near a lake whose waters reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. Temujin's forces were outnumbered, but they had advantages that were not immediately apparent. His army was more unified, his commanders more experienced, and his soldiers more personally loyal to their leader. The battle began at dawn with a massive cavalry charge by the Karaites, their armor glinting in the morning sun as they thundered across the grassland. Temujin's forces absorbed the charge, giving ground in a controlled manner that drew the Karaites into a carefully prepared trap. As the enemy cavalry pursued what they thought was a retreating army, they found themselves surrounded by Mongol forces that had been concealed in the tall grass. The fighting was desperate and brutal, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage for most of the day. The Karaites fought with the courage of desperation, knowing that defeat would mean the end of their independence. The Mongols fought with the discipline that Temujin had instilled in them, each unit supporting the others in a display of military coordination that was unprecedented on the steppes. As the sun began to set, the tide of battle finally turned. A charge led by Temujin himself broke the center of the Karait line, and suddenly, their army was in full retreat. Togrul, the Wang Khan, was killed in the fighting, and Sengam fled westward toward the Naimans. The victory was complete, and with it, the Karaites ceased to exist as an independent power. The defeat of the Karaites left only the Naimans as a major obstacle to Temujin's dominance of the steppes. Tayang Khan, the Naiman leader, was an intelligent and capable ruler who had watched the rise of the Mongol leader with growing alarm. He understood that the traditional balance of power on the steppes had been forever altered, and that the Naimans faced a fight for their very existence. Tayang Khan attempted to forge a grand alliance against Temujin, reaching out to the remnants of the defeated tribes and to Jamuka, who had survived the fall of the Karaites. The alliance was formidable on paper, but it suffered from the same weaknesses that had plagued all previous attempts at steppe unity. The leaders were united only in their opposition to Temujin, not in any positive vision for the future. The final campaign of the steppe unification wars began in 1204, when Temujin led his army westward toward the Naiman lands. The landscape changed as they moved west, the grass becoming shorter and the hills more rugged. This was unfamiliar territory for many of Temujin's warriors, but they advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat under their leader's command. The decisive battle was fought at Chakamaut, where the Naiman army awaited the Mongol assault. Tayang Khan had chosen his position carefully, placing his forces on high ground with their flanks protected by steep ravines. The Naimans were well equipped and numerous, but they lacked the unity of purpose that characterized Temujin's forces. Some of their allied contingents were already wavering, uncertain of their commitment to the fight. Temujin demonstrated his tactical genius by refusing to launch a direct assault on the prepared Naiman position. Instead, he had his forces light extra campfires and move constantly, creating the impression that his army was much larger than it actually was. The psychological effect on the Naimans was devastating, as they began to doubt their chances of victory even before the battle began. The actual fighting was brief but decisive. When Temujin finally launched his attack, it came from an unexpected direction, with Mongol forces appearing on the Naiman flanks as if by magic. The Allied army collapsed almost immediately, with many contingents fleeing without fighting. Tayang Khan was killed in the rout, and with him died the last organized resistance to Mongol supremacy on the eastern steppes. The victory at Shakyamut marked the effective end of the steppe unification wars. Jamukha, the last of Temujin's major rivals, was captured shortly afterward and executed, though not before a final meeting between the two former blood brothers. According to the secret history of the Mongols, Jamukha acknowledged Temujin's superior leadership while requesting an honorable death. Temujin granted this request, having Jamukha killed without spilling his blood, in accordance with Mongol customs regarding the death of nobles. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, the unified Mongol tribes proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The ceremony took place on the banks of the Onon River, where the shamans proclaimed that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had granted Temujin dominion over all peoples who lived under its dome. The transformation from tribal chieftain to imperial ruler was complete, but it was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the night continues to embrace you, let your thoughts drift to that moment when a new empire was born. The proclamation of Genghis Khan as universal ruler was not just a political ceremony, but a fundamental shift in the nature of steppe society. For the first time in their history, the Mongol tribes were truly united under a single leader, and that leader had ambitions that extended far beyond the grasslands of his birth. The newly proclaimed Genghis Khan wasted no time in organizing his empire for the greater conquests that lay ahead. The decimal system of military organization was extended throughout the Mongol forces, creating an army of unprecedented size and efficiency. The traditional clan loyalties were deliberately weakened by mixing warriors from different tribes in the same units, ensuring that their primary loyalty was to the Khan rather than to their birth tribe. The Yasa, the great law code of the Mongol Empire, was formally promulgated during this period. The Yasa was revolutionary in its scope and fairness, establishing principles that would govern the empire for generations. It mandated religious tolerance, established protections for merchants and diplomats, and created a merit-based system of advancement that was unique in the medieval world. The code was harsh in its punishments, but fair in its application, treating all subjects equally regardless of their ethnic or religious background. One of the most significant innovations of the early Mongol Empire was the establishment of the yam, a relay system of communication that would eventually span the entire empire. Fresh horses were stationed at regular intervals along the major routes, allowing messages to travel at unprecedented speed across vast distances. The system was initially developed for military purposes, but soon became crucial for administration and trade. The organization of the Mongol military was equally revolutionary. The army was divided into units of 10,000 called tumens, each commanded by a general personally appointed by the Khan. These tumens were further subdivided into thousands, hundreds, and tens, creating a clear chain of command that allowed for rapid deployment and tactical flexibility. The system was so efficient that it would be copied by many later armies. Genghis Khan's first major external target was the Western Xia Kingdom, a Tangut state that controlled the Silk Road corridor through what is now northern China. The Western Xia was strategically located and wealthy from trade, but it was also relatively weak militarily. The Khan saw it as an ideal testing ground for his newly organized army and a source of the wealth needed to fund larger campaigns. The invasion of Western Xia began in 1209 and revealed the Mongols' adaptation to siege warfare. The steppes had not prepared them for attacking fortified cities, but they proved remarkably adept at learning new military techniques. They employed Chinese and other foreign engineers to build siege equipment and developed innovative tactics for storming walls. The Mongol reputation for being invincible in the field was soon matched by their reputation as formidable besiegers. The capital of Western Xia, Zhongxing, was besieged for several months, and its fall marked the first major victory of the Mongol Empire outside the steppes. The Khan's treatment of the conquered city was relatively lenient, as he needed to demonstrate that submission to Mongol rule could be beneficial. The Tangut rulers were allowed to maintain nominal independence in exchange for tribute and military service. The success in Western Xia brought the Mongols to the attention of the Jin dynasty, which had watched the unification of the steppes with growing alarm. The Jin rulers understood that a united Mongolia posed an existential threat to their empire, and they began to prepare for what they saw as an inevitable conflict. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the political landscape of East Asia. Genghis Khan's declaration of war against the Jin dynasty was both personal and strategic. Personal, because the Jin had long manipulated steppe politics to keep the Mongols divided. Strategic, because the Jin controlled the wealth and technology that the Mongols needed to build a true empire. The Khan proclaimed that the eternal blue sky had granted him dominion over all peoples, and the Jin's resistance was therefore an act of defiance against heaven itself. The Mongol invasion of Jin territory began in 1211 and revealed the true extent of the military revolution that Genghis Khan had wrought. The Jin had expected to face the traditional Mongol style of warfare, hit-and-run raids followed by rapid retreats. Instead, they found themselves confronting a disciplined army capable of sustained campaigns and complex operations. The Mongols had evolved from raiders into conquerors. The siege of Yanjing, the Jin capital that would later become Beijing, demonstrated the Mongols' growing sophistication in warfare. The city was one of the most strongly fortified in the world, with massive walls and a garrison of seasoned troops. The Mongols invested the city with patience, cutting off its supply lines and slowly starving it into submission. When the city finally fell in 1215, it marked the effective end of Jin power north of the Yellow River. The wealth captured from the Jin cities was beyond anything the Mongols had previously imagined. Gold, silver, silk, and precious stones flowed into the Mongol treasury, providing the resources needed for even greater campaigns. More importantly, the Mongols gained access to Chinese administrative expertise and military technology, including gunpowder weapons and sophisticated siege engines. As your mind drifts peacefully through this tale of conquest, let yourself imagine the transformation that was taking place in the Mongol Empire. What had begun as a confederation of nomadic tribes was rapidly evolving into a sophisticated state capable of governing sedentary populations. The Khan surrounded himself with advisors from many different cultures, creating a cosmopolitan court that reflected the empire's growing diversity. The integration of Chinese scholars and administrators into the Mongol government was particularly significant. These men brought with them centuries of experience in governing large populations and complex economies. They helped establish the bureaucratic systems that would allow the Mongol Empire to function effectively across vast distances and diverse cultures. The traditional Mongol emphasis on personal loyalty was supplemented by institutional structures that could survive the death of individual leaders. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance was pragmatic rather than ideological. Local customs and laws were generally respected as long as they did not conflict with Mongol interests. Religious freedom was guaranteed, and the Mongols actively sought to learn from the peoples they conquered. This flexibility would prove to be one of the empire's greatest strengths, allowing it to adapt to the varied conditions it encountered across Eurasia. The success of the Jin campaign established Genghis Khan as one of the great conquerors of history, but it also created new challenges. The empire was growing too large to be governed by the informal methods that had sufficed for the steppes. The Khan needed to establish permanent administrative structures and develop systems for managing the diverse populations that now lived under Mongol rule. The solution was to create a dual system of government that combined Mongol military leadership with local administrative expertise. Mongol generals retained ultimate authority, but they were assisted by local officials who understood the customs and needs of the subject populations. This system would prove remarkably durable, surviving the division of the empire and lasting for centuries in some regions. The growing complexity of the empire also required new approaches to diplomacy and trade. The Mongols had traditionally viewed other peoples as either enemies to be conquered or subjects to be ruled. Now they needed to develop relationships with distant powers that were too far away to be easily conquered. The establishment of diplomatic relations with various kingdoms and empires marked a new phase in Mongol development. The Mongol diplomatic system was based on the concept of universal empire, the idea that the Khan was the rightful ruler of all peoples under heaven. Foreign rulers were expected to acknowledge this supremacy and pay tribute, but those who did so were granted considerable autonomy in their internal affairs. The system was hierarchical, but not necessarily oppressive, offering benefits to those who cooperated with Mongol rule. The years following the conquest of the Jin saw a period of consolidation and internal development. The Khan established his capital at Karakoram, a city that would become the center of the largest empire in human history. The city was strategically located on the steppes, but also served as a meeting point for trade routes from across Eurasia. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars from dozens of cultures converged there, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the empire's global reach. The establishment of Karakoram as the imperial capital marked a significant departure from traditional Mongol nomadism. While the Khan and his court continued to maintain their mobile lifestyle, they now had a permanent base that could serve as an administrative center. The city became a symbol of Mongol power and sophistication, demonstrating that the former nomads had successfully adapted to the requirements of ruling a sedentary empire. The court at Karakoram was a marvel of medieval diplomacy and administration. Representatives from across the known world gathered there to seek audiences with the Khan, bringing tribute and seeking trade agreements. The Khan's advisors included Muslims from Central Asia, Christians from Europe, Buddhists from China, and shamans from the steppes. This diversity of counsel allowed the Mongols to develop policies that were informed by the best practices of many different civilizations. As the night deepens and your breathing grows even more peaceful, let your mind rest on the image of that great capital rising from the grasslands. Karakoram was more than just a city. It was a symbol of the Mongol Empire's unique character. Unlike other medieval empires that imposed their culture on conquered peoples, the Mongols created a synthesis that drew from the best of all the civilizations they encountered. The religious policy of the Mongol Empire was particularly remarkable for its time. In an age when religious conflict was common, the Mongols mandated tolerance and even encouraged religious debate. The Khan personally met with representatives of different faiths, seeking to understand their teachings and incorporate their wisdom into his rule. This policy of religious freedom would become one of the empire's most distinctive features. The economic policies of the empire were equally innovative. The Mongols understood that trade was the lifeblood of their empire, and they took active steps to promote commerce across their territories. The famous Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, made it possible for merchants to travel safely from Europe to China for the first time in centuries. The empire's roads were patrolled by Mongol troops, and its communication system ensured that news of any threats would reach the authorities quickly. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, was expanded to serve not just military and administrative needs, but also commercial ones. Merchants could send messages ahead to arrange for goods to be ready for pickup, and they could receive news of market conditions in distant cities. This information network gave Mongol merchants significant advantages over their competitors and contributed to the empire's growing wealth. The standardization of weights and measures across the empire was another innovation that facilitated trade. Previously, merchants had to deal with dozens of different systems as they traveled from one region to another. The Mongols established uniform standards that made commerce much more efficient and reduced the opportunities for fraud and dispute. The Mongol Empire's approach to taxation was also revolutionary. Rather than relying on the arbitrary levies that characterized most medieval states, the Mongols established systematic tax collection based on accurate population counts and economic assessments. This approach was more fair and predictable, which encouraged economic development and reduced the likelihood of rebellion. The growing prosperity of the empire attracted attention from distant lands, and by 1218, Genghis Khan had received embassies from kingdoms as far away as Europe. The most significant of these diplomatic contacts was with the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia and Persia. The Khwarezm Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruled over territories that included some of the world's most prosperous cities, including Samarkand and Bukhara. Initially, relations between the Mongol Empire and Khwarezm were peaceful and mutually beneficial. The Mongols were interested in trade, particularly in the luxury goods that passed through the Silk Road cities under Khwarezmian control. The Khwarezm Shah, for his part, was happy to profit from this trade and had no immediate territorial disputes with the distant Mongol Empire. The peace between the two empires was shattered by what appeared to be a relatively minor incident, but would have momentous consequences. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan of several hundred merchants was attacked and destroyed in the city of Otrar by the local governor, Inalchuk, who accused the merchants of being spies. The attack resulted in the deaths of nearly all the merchants and the confiscation of goods worth a fortune. Genghis Khan's initial response was measured and diplomatic. He sent an embassy to the Khwarezm Shah, demanding the extradition of the governor responsible for the massacre and compensation for the losses. This was a reasonable request by the standards of international law, and compliance would have maintained peace between the two empires. However, the Khwarezm Shah's response was catastrophically ill-judged. Rather than punishing the governor of Otrar, the Khwarezm Shah executed the head of the Mongol embassy and sent the other members back with their beards shaved off, a deliberate insult in the diplomatic customs of the time. This act of defiance was seen by Genghis Khan as a declaration of war, and he began preparations for what would become one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire began in 1219 with an army of approximately 200,000 warriors, the largest force that Genghis Khan had ever assembled. The army was organized into 4 main columns, each commanded by one of the Khan's most trusted generals. The strategy was to attack multiple targets simultaneously, preventing the enemy from concentrating their forces for an effective defense. The speed of the Mongol advance caught the Khwarezmians completely off guard. Cities that had expected weeks or months of warning found Mongol armies at their gates within days of the invasion's beginning. The Mongol intelligence network, built up over years of trade and diplomatic contact, provided detailed information about enemy fortifications, troop movements, and supply lines. The siege of Otrar, the city where the merchant caravan had been massacred, was conducted with particular ferocity. Genghis Khan personally supervised the assault, ensuring that the governor who had started the war would face the full consequences of his actions. The city held out for several months, but when it finally fell, Inalchuk was executed in a manner that sent a clear message to other cities about the price of defying Mongol authority. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep, let your mind wander across the vast distances that the Mongol armies covered in their westward advance. The empire was expanding at a rate that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. Cities that had stood for centuries were falling in days, and the balance of power across Central Asia was shifting with each passing week. The fall of Bukhara in 1220 demonstrated the Mongols' evolving approach to psychological warfare. Rather than simply besieging the city, Genghis Khan entered it personally and addressed the population from the pulpit of the main mosque. he declared that he was the punishment of God, sent to chastise them for their sins. This dramatic gesture, combining religious symbolism with political theatre, had a profound impact on the city's inhabitants, and news of it spread throughout the region. The treatment of Bukhara also revealed the Mongols' sophisticated understanding of how to govern conquered populations. The city's religious and intellectual leaders were largely spared, and the Mongols actively recruited scholars and administrators to serve in their growing bureaucracy. This policy of selective mercy, combined with devastating punishment for resistance, became a hallmark of Mongol conquest strategy. The siege of Samarkand, one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, showcased the Mongols' mastery of siege warfare. The city's fortifications were among the strongest in Central Asia, and its garrison was large and well-equipped. However, the Mongols had learned to use the populations of previously conquered cities to provide labor for their siege works, creating a system that turned the empire's growth into a self-reinforcing cycle of military power. The psychological impact of the Mongol conquests was perhaps even more important than their military effectiveness. Stories of entire cities being destroyed and their populations killed or enslaved spread throughout the Islamic world, creating a climate of terror that often led to surrender without resistance. The Mongols cultivated this reputation deliberately, understanding that fear could be more effective than actual violence in achieving their goals. The pursuit of the Khwarezm Shah became a personal obsession for Genghis Khan. The Shah's refusal to submit to Mongol authority was seen as a challenge to the very foundations of the universal empire that the Khan was building. The Shah fled from city to city, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers. But the relentless pressure of the Mongol pursuit gradually wore down his supporters and his will to resist. The Shah's flight took him across Persia and into the regions around the Caspian Sea, with Mongol armies in constant pursuit. The chase demonstrated the incredible mobility of Mongol forces and their ability to maintain pursuit across vast distances. The Shah finally died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, broken by the strain of constant flight and the collapse of his empire. The death of the Khwarezm Shah did not end the war, as his son Jalal al-Din continued to resist from the mountains of Afghanistan. This phase of the conflict revealed another aspect of Mongol military genius: their ability to adapt to different types of terrain and warfare. The mountainous regions of Afghanistan were very different from the steppes where the Mongols had originated, but they proved equally capable of fighting in this challenging environment. The pursuit of Jalal al-Din took the Mongols into the Indian subcontinent for the first time, where they encountered the monsoon climate and the complex political landscape of medieval India. The campaign demonstrated the Mongols' remarkable adaptability, but it also showed the limits of their expansion. The distances involved and the unfamiliar environment made it difficult to maintain the supply lines that their armies required. The return journey from India marked the end of Genghis Khan's Great Western Campaign, but it also began a new phase in the empire's development. The vast territories that had been conquered needed to be organized and governed, and the wealth that had been captured needed to be used effectively. The Khan had proven that the Mongol Empire could conquer virtually any territory, but the greater challenge was learning how to rule effectively over such diverse populations. The years following the Khwarezmian campaign saw significant changes in the structure of the Mongol Empire. The traditional nomadic lifestyle was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the empire's responsibilities grew more complex. The Khan spent more time in Karakorum, dealing with administrative matters and diplomatic correspondence from across the known world. The integration of Persian and Central Asian administrative systems into the Mongol government was particularly important during this period. The Persians had centuries of experience in governing large, diverse populations, and their bureaucratic methods were well suited to the Mongols' needs. Persian became the language of administration in much of the western part of the empire, while Chinese systems continued to be used in the east. The religious policies of the empire also evolved during this period. The Mongols' traditional shamanism was supplemented by influences from the various religions they encountered in their conquered territories. The Khan himself showed interest in different faiths, meeting with Muslim clerics, Christian missionaries, and Buddhist monks. This religious curiosity was not just personal, but reflected the empire's need to accommodate the beliefs of its diverse subjects. The establishment of religious freedom as a fundamental principle of Mongol rule was revolutionary for its time. In an age when religious wars were common and persecution of minorities was the norm, the Mongols created an environment where different faiths could coexist peacefully. This policy was not just humanitarian, but practical, as it reduced the likelihood of religiously motivated rebellions. As the night continues to envelop you in its peaceful embrace, let your thoughts drift to the great challenges that face the aging Khan. The empire had grown beyond anything that had ever existed before, but with that growth came responsibilities and problems that no ruler had ever faced. The question of succession was becoming increasingly urgent, as the Khan was now in his 60s and had no clear heir. The issue of succession was complicated by the traditional Mongol practice of dividing inheritance among all of a leader's sons. This system had worked well for managing herds and tribal territories, but it was potentially disastrous for a unified empire. The Khan was acutely aware that division of the empire could lead to civil war and the destruction of everything he had built. The four sons of Genghis Khan each represented different aspects of his character and different visions for the empire's future. Yochi, the eldest, was an able military commander, but remained under the cloud of questionable legitimacy. Chagatai was known for his strict adherence to Mongol law and tradition. Ogadai was praised for his diplomatic skills and administrative ability. Tolui, the youngest, was considered the most militarily gifted, but was perhaps too aggressive for the empire's long-term stability. The Khan's solution to the succession problem was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than following strict rules of primogeniture, he chose the son who seemed best suited to rule the empire effectively. Ogadai was designated as the Great Khan's successor, while his brothers were given substantial territories to rule as autonomous Khans under the overall authority of the Great Khan. This arrangement represented a compromise between Mongol traditions and the practical needs of governing a vast empire. The unity of the empire was maintained through the institution of the Great Khan, while the traditional Mongol practice of dividing inheritance was accommodated through the creation of subordinate khanates. The system would prove to be both a strength and a weakness in the empire's future development. The final years of Genghis Khan's reign were marked by a return to the steppes and the values that had shaped his early life. The campaign against the Western Xia, which the Khan undertook in his final years, was motivated partly by the need to punish the Tanguts for their disloyalty, but also by the aging ruler's desire to die as he had lived, as a warrior leading his people in battle. The siege of the Western Xia capital was prolonged and difficult, testing the endurance of both the Mongol forces and their aging leader. The Khan's health was failing, but he refused to abandon the campaign, seeing it as a matter of honor and a test of Mongol resolve. The city finally fell, but the victory came at a great cost. Genghis Khan died shortly after the conquest, in 1227, at the age of 65. The death of Genghis Khan marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new phase in the Mongol Empire's development. The empire that he had created was still young and growing, and it would reach its greatest extent under his successors. The institutions that he had established and the principles that he had articulated would guide the empire for generations to come. The funeral of Genghis Khan was conducted according to ancient Mongol traditions, with the body being buried in a secret location on the steppes. The burial party killed everyone they encountered on the way to the burial site to ensure that the location would remain hidden. To this day, the tomb of the greatest conqueror in human history has never been found, adding an element of mystery to his already legendary status. The succession of Ögedei as Great Khan was accomplished smoothly, demonstrating the effectiveness of the institutional arrangements that Genghis Khan had established. The Kurultai that confirmed Ögedei's succession was attended by representatives from across the empire, symbolizing the unity that had been maintained despite the empire's vast size and diversity. Ögedei Khan brought different qualities to the role of Great Khan than his father had possessed. Where Genghis Khan had been primarily a military leader and conqueror, Ögedei was more interested in administration and consolidation. His reign would see the empire reach its greatest territorial extent, but it would also see the beginning of the processes that would eventually lead to its fragmentation. The continuation of the Mongol conquests under Ögedei demonstrated that the empire's expansion was not dependent on the personal leadership of its founder. The military machine that Genghis Khan had created continued to function effectively under new leadership, suggesting that the institutional reforms he had implemented were truly revolutionary in their scope and effectiveness. As your mind grows ever more peaceful, let yourself imagine the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire at the height of its power. From the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, from the Arctic tundra to the Indian Ocean, the empire encompassed territories and peoples of incredible diversity. The Pax Mongolica had created a zone of peace and prosperity that facilitated trade and cultural exchange on a scale never before seen in human history. The reign of Ögedei Khan saw the completion of the conquest of the Jin dynasty, a task that had been left unfinished at the time of Genghis Khan's death. The final campaigns against the Jin demonstrated the Mongols' continued military superiority and their ability to adapt their tactics to different types of warfare. The fall of the Jin capital in 1234 marked the end of Yuetian rule in northern China and brought vast new territories under Mongol control. The conquest of the Jin was followed by the invasion of the Song dynasty in southern China, but this proved to be a much more difficult undertaking. The Song were technologically advanced and had strong natural defenses, including the Yangtze River and the mountainous terrain of southern China. The campaign would drag on for decades, testing the Mongols' patience and resources. Simultaneously with the campaigns in China, Mongol armies were advancing into Europe under the leadership of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. The European campaign began with the conquest of the Russ's principalities, including the important cities of Kiev and Moscow. The speed and effectiveness of the Mongol advance shocked the European powers, who had no experience of steppe warfare tactics. The Battle of Mohi in Hungary in 1241 demonstrated the Mongols' tactical superiority over European heavy cavalry. The Hungarian army, which represented the best of European military tradition, was completely destroyed by Mongol forces, using their traditional tactics of mobility and archery. The victory opened the path to Western Europe and created panic among the European kingdoms. The death of Ögedei Khan in 1241 probably saved Western Europe from Mongol conquest. The Mongol armies were recalled to participate in the succession Kurultai, and by the time the succession was settled, the moment for European conquest had passed. The empire's attention had turned to other priorities, and the opportunity to extend Mongol rule to the Atlantic Ocean was lost forever. The succession crisis that followed Ögedei's death revealed the inherent weaknesses in the Mongol succession system. The Kurultai that was supposed to choose the new Great Khan became a battleground for competing factions, with different branches of the imperial family supporting different candidates. The crisis lasted for several years and significantly weakened the empire's unity. The eventual succession of Genghis Khan in 1251 restored stability to the empire, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase characterized by increased centralization and bureaucratization. Genghis was a capable administrator who worked to strengthen the empire's institutions and improve its efficiency. His reign saw significant reforms in taxation, administration, and military organization. Under Genghis' leadership, the empire resumed its expansion, with major campaigns launched against the Song dynasty in China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. These campaigns would be led by Genghis' brothers, Kublai Khan in China and Hulagu Khan in the Middle East, both of whom would establish dynasties that would rule their respective regions for centuries. The Mongol invasion of the Middle East under Hulagu Khan was one of the most destructive campaigns in the empire's history. The siege and destruction of Baghdad in 1258 marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom, with its irreplaceable collection of books and manuscripts, was destroyed, representing a loss to human knowledge that can never be calculated. The conquest of Baghdad demonstrated both the Mongols' military capabilities and their sometimes destructive impact on the civilizations they conquered. The city, which had been one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the medieval world, was reduced to ruins, and its population was largely massacred. The psychological impact of Baghdad's fall reverberated throughout the Islamic world. The Mongol advance into the Middle East was finally halted by the Mamluks of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. This was one of the few major defeats suffered by Mongol armies, and it marked the western limit of their expansion. The victory of the Mamluks demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible and encouraged resistance movements throughout their empire. The division of the Mongol Empire into separate khanates was formalized during this period, with each branch of the imperial family ruling over specific territories. The Yuan dynasty was established in China under Kublai Khan. The Ilkhanate was created in Persia under Hulagu Khan. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes and Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia. As the night deepens around you, bringing the most restful sleep, let your mind rest on this moment of transformation, when the unified Mongol Empire gave way to a confederation of related but independent states. The process was gradual and not without conflict, but it reflected the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories from a single center. The reign of Kublai Khan in China represented the culmination of Mongol adaptation to sedentary governance. Kublai established his capital at Dadu, the city that would later become Beijing, and created a court that rivaled any in the world for its splendor and sophistication. The Mongol rulers of China became, in many ways, Chinese emperors who happened to be of Mongol origin. The completion of the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279 marked the first time in Chinese history that the entire country was ruled by a foreign dynasty. The Mongols' success in China was due partly to their military superiority, but also to their willingness to adopt Chinese administrative practices and to employ Chinese scholars and officials in their government. The attempted Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 demonstrated the limits of their military capabilities. Both invasion fleets were destroyed by storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine winds. The failures in Japan marked the end of Mongol expansion in East Asia and showed that natural barriers could be as effective as military resistance in stopping their advance. The Mongol Empire's impact on trade and cultural exchange was perhaps even more significant than its military conquests. The Pax Mongolica created safe passage for merchants, missionaries, and scholars across the entire breadth of Eurasia. The Silk Road reached its greatest extent and importance during the Mongol period, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. The exchange of technologies across the Mongol Empire accelerated human development in numerous fields. Gunpowder, originally invented in China, spread westward through Mongol territories and revolutionized warfare in the Middle East and Europe. The printing press, compass, and other Chinese innovations also spread along Mongol trade routes, contributing to the Renaissance in Europe. The religious tolerance of the Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented exchanges between different faith traditions. Christian missionaries reached China, Buddhist monks traveled to Persia, and Islamic scholars studied in Mongol courts. This religious exchange enriched all the traditions involved and contributed to the development of new forms of art, literature, and philosophy. The Mongol Empire's administrative innovations also had lasting impacts on the regions they ruled. The concept of a unified legal code applied across different ethnic and religious groups was revolutionary and would influence legal development for centuries. The Mongol emphasis on meritocracy over hereditary privilege also challenged traditional social hierarchies and created opportunities for advancement based on ability rather than birth. The postal system established by the Mongols was the most extensive communication network in the medieval world. The yam stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, allowing messages to travel thousands of miles in a matter of weeks. This system facilitated not only government administration, but also commercial and cultural exchange. The decline of the Mongol Empire was as gradual as its rise had been sudden. The vast distances involved in governing the empire, combined with the different challenges faced by each khanate, gradually led to divergent development paths. The khanates began to adopt the characteristics of their subject populations, becoming more Chinese in China, more Persian in Iran, and more Turkic in Central Asia. The conversion of the Mongol rulers to the religions of their subjects was a key factor in the empire's transformation. In China, the Mongol rulers adopted Chinese cultural practices while maintaining their political supremacy. In the Middle East, the Ilkhans converted to Islam and became patrons of Islamic art and architecture. In the Golden Horde, the rulers adopted Islam and Turkish cultural practices. The Black Death, which spread along the trade routes that the Mongols had established, was ironically one of the factors that contributed to the empire's decline. The plague devastated populations across Eurasia and disrupted the trade networks that had been crucial to the empire's prosperity. The reduced population and economic disruption made it more difficult to maintain the administrative systems that had held the empire together. The final collapse of Mongol rule came at different times in different regions. In China, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming in 1368, ending nearly a century of Mongol rule. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fragmented in the 1330s, giving way to various successor states. The Golden Horde lasted longer, but was gradually weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures. As you drift into the deepest and most peaceful sleep, let your final thoughts rest on the extraordinary legacy of the Mongol Empire. Though the empire itself lasted only a few centuries, its impact on world history was profound and lasting. The Mongols created the first truly global empire, connecting East and West in ways that had never been possible before. The Mongol Empire's greatest achievement was perhaps its demonstration that people of different cultures, religions, and backgrounds could coexist peacefully under a single government. The empire's religious tolerance and cultural flexibility created a model of multicultural governance that was centuries ahead of its time. The Mongol example showed that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The technologies, ideas, and artistic forms that spread through the Mongol Empire contributed to human development in countless ways. The exchange of knowledge between different civilizations, facilitated by Mongol rule, accelerated progress in fields ranging from medicine to astronomy. The Renaissance in Europe, the Islamic Golden Age's final flowering, and the cultural achievements of Yuan dynasty China all benefited from the cross-cultural exchange that the Mongols made possible. The Mongol Empire's impact on trade and commerce was equally significant. The safe passage that merchants enjoyed under Mongol protection allowed for the development of truly global trade networks. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Karakoram became cosmopolitan centers where merchants from dozens of cultures met to exchange goods and ideas. The prosperity that resulted from this trade benefited all the empire's subjects. The legal and administrative innovations of the Mongol Empire influenced governance systems for centuries after the empire's fall. The concept of a unified legal code, religious tolerance, and merit-based advancement all became important principles in later empires and states. The Mongol example demonstrated that large, diverse populations could be governed effectively if the right institutions and policies were in place. The environmental impact of the Mongol Empire was also significant, though often overlooked. The empire's policies led to reforestation in some areas as agricultural land was abandoned, while in other regions, the disruption of traditional land management practices had negative consequences. The Mongols' own lifestyle, based on sustainable nomadic practices, offered lessons about living in harmony with the natural environment. The Mongol Empire's military innovations influenced warfare for centuries. The emphasis on mobility, the use of composite bows, and the integration of siege warfare techniques all became standard practices in later armies. The Mongol decimal system of military organization was adopted by many subsequent empires and remains influential in modern military structures. The cultural legacy of the Mongol Empire can be seen in the artistic and literary traditions of the regions they ruled. The fusion of different artistic styles, encouraged by Mongol patronage, created new forms of expression that enriched all the cultures involved. The epic literature of the Mongols, including the secret history, became a model for historical writing and national mythology. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire is still visible today, with genetic studies showing that millions of people across Eurasia carry genetic markers associated with Mongol ancestry. This biological legacy is a testament to the empire's vast reach and the movement of peoples that it facilitated. The Mongol Empire truly left its mark on humanity in every possible way. The final saga of the Mongol Empire is not one of destruction and decline, but of transformation and synthesis. The empire did not simply disappear, but evolved into the many different states and cultures that succeeded it. Like a great river that divides into many streams, while continuing to nourish the landscape, the Mongol Empire flowed into numerous successor states, each carrying forward different aspects of the Great Khan's vision while adapting to local conditions and requirements. In China, the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan represented perhaps the most successful synthesis of Mongol and Chinese traditions. The Mongol rulers adopted the mandate of heaven, the ancient Chinese concept that legitimized imperial rule, while maintaining their own cultural identity and military traditions. The Yuan court became a center of learning and artistic achievement, where Chinese scholars worked alongside Persian astronomers, Arab mathematicians, and European traders to create a truly cosmopolitan civilization. The architectural achievements of the Yuan dynasty reflected this cultural synthesis. The palace complex at Dadu, with its blend of Mongol and Chinese design elements, demonstrated how the nomadic traditions of the steppes could be adapted to the requirements of sedentary imperial rule. The great halls where the Khan held court were designed to accommodate both the formal ceremonies of Chinese imperial tradition and the more informal gatherings that characterized Mongol leadership style. The Yuan dynasty's patronage of the arts led to remarkable innovations in literature, painting, and drama. Chinese poetry flourished under Mongol rule, with poets finding new themes in the cultural exchange that characterized the empire. The development of Yuan drama, which combined Chinese literary traditions with influences from across the Mongol Empire, created new forms of theatrical expression that would influence Chinese culture for centuries to come. As the night grows deeper and your mind finds perfect tranquility, imagine the scholars and artists of the Yuan court working by lamplight in their studies, creating works that bridged the gap between East and West. The astronomical instruments they developed, combining Chinese observations with Islamic mathematical techniques, advanced human understanding of the cosmos. The maps they drew, incorporating information from Mongol travelers who had journeyed to the ends of the earth, expanded the known world beyond anything previously imagined. The Yuan dynasty's approach to governance also represented a synthesis of different traditions. The Mongol emphasis on meritocracy was combined with Chinese administrative expertise to create a bureaucratic system that was both efficient and fair. The examination system that selected government officials was modified to include candidates from different ethnic backgrounds, breaking down traditional barriers that had limited advancement to members of certain social classes. The religious policies of the Yuan dynasty continued the Mongol tradition of tolerance while adapting to Chinese religious sensibilities. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all received imperial patronage, while Nestorian Christianity and Islam were also protected and allowed to flourish. This religious diversity enriched Chinese culture and contributed to philosophical developments that would influence Chinese thought for generations. The decline of the Yuan dynasty in the 14th century was caused by a combination of factors, including natural disasters, economic difficulties, and the gradual loss of Mongol military efficiency. As the Mongol rulers became more Chinese in their outlook and lifestyle, they lost some of the martial virtues that had made their ancestors invincible. The Red Turban Rebellion, led by Zhu Yuanzhang, eventually overthrew the Yuan and established the Ming dynasty in 1368. Yet even the fall of the Yuan dynasty did not end the Mongol influence on Chinese civilization. The Ming dynasty, despite its rhetoric of restoring Chinese rule, retained many of the administrative innovations of the Mongol period. The capital remained at Beijing, the city that the Mongols had built, and the imperial palace complex continued to reflect the architectural synthesis that had been developed under Yuan rule. In Persia, the Ilkhanate created by Hulagu Khan underwent a similar process of cultural synthesis, though with different results. The Mongol rulers of Persia gradually converted to Islam and became patrons of Islamic art and learning. The Ilkhanate period saw remarkable achievements in miniature painting, architecture, and historical writing that combined Persian traditions with influences from across the Mongol Empire. The great historian Rashid al-Din, who served the Ilkhan court, exemplified the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol rule in Persia. His universal history, the Jami' al-Tawarikh, was the most comprehensive historical work of its time, incorporating information about Chinese, Indian, European, and Islamic civilizations. The manuscripts of this work, illustrated with miniatures that showed influences from Chinese painting techniques, demonstrated the artistic synthesis that characterized the Ilkhanate period. The Ilkhanate's patronage of architecture produced some of the most beautiful buildings in the Islamic world. The mausoleum of Genghis Khan in Tabriz, with its innovative design and exquisite tile work, showed how Mongol rulers had become sophisticated patrons of Islamic art. The combination of traditional Persian architectural elements with influences from Chinese and Central Asian traditions created a distinctive style that would influence Persian architecture for centuries. The conversion of the Ilkhan rulers to Islam was a gradual process that reflected the pragmatic approach to religion that had characterized Mongol rule from its beginning. The Khans understood that effective rule required the support of their subjects, and in a predominantly Muslim region, conversion to Islam was a practical necessity. Yet the Mongol tradition of religious tolerance continued, and Christians, Jews, and Buddhists continued to receive protection under Ilkhanate rule. The economic policies of the Ilkhanate showed the same synthesis of traditions that characterized other aspects of their rule. The Mongol emphasis on promoting trade was combined with Persian administrative expertise to create commercial networks that extended from Europe to China. The silk and spice trades that passed through Persian territories under Ilkhanate protection brought unprecedented prosperity to the region. The decline of the Ilkhanates in the 1330s was followed by a period of fragmentation, but the Mongol influence on Persian culture continued through the various successor states. The Timurid Empire, established by Tamerlane in the late 14th century, claimed descent from Genghis Khan and attempted to recreate the glories of the Mongol Empire. The Safavid dynasty, which ruled Persia from the 16th to 18th centuries, also drew on Mongol traditions of governance and military organization. In the Golden Horde, which controlled the Western Steppes and much of Eastern Europe, the process of cultural synthesis took yet another form. The Mongol rulers of this region gradually adopted Turkish culture and the Islamic religion, creating a distinctive Turco-Mongol civilization that would have lasting impacts on the development of Russia and Eastern Europe. The Golden Horde's influence on Russian development was profound and lasting. The Mongol system of governance, with its emphasis on centralized authority and efficient administration, provided a model that would later be adopted by the emerging Russian state. The tribute system established by the Golden Horde created the administrative structures that would eventually be used by the Russian Empire to govern its vast territories. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, let your mind wander to the great cities of the Golden Horde, where Mongol Khans held court in palaces that reflected the wealth generated by their control of the trade routes between Europe and Asia. Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, was a cosmopolitan city where merchants from Venice, scholars from Cairo, and craftsmen from Central Asia gathered to exchange goods and ideas. The Golden Horde's approach to governing its Russian subjects was typically Mongol in its pragmatism. Local rulers were allowed to maintain their positions as long as they acknowledged Mongol supremacy and paid tribute. This system of indirect rule minimized the costs of administration while ensuring Mongol control over the region's resources. The system worked so well that it was later adopted by the Russian Empire in governing its own diverse territories. The gradual decline of the Golden Horde was caused by internal conflicts and the rising power of the Russian principalities. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where Russian forces under Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Golden Horde army, marked the beginning of the end of Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe. Yet, even as their political power waned, the Mongols' cultural influence on Russian development continued. The various successor states of the Golden Horde, including the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and the Astrakhan Khanate, preserved different aspects of the Mongol legacy well into the modern period. These states maintained the Mongol tradition of religious tolerance and efficient administration, while adapting to the changing political landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate underwent its own process of transformation and cultural synthesis. The Mongol rulers of this region gradually adopted Turkish culture and Islamic religion, creating a distinctive Central Asian civilization that combined nomadic traditions with sedentary Islamic culture. The cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, which had been devastated during the original Mongol conquest, were rebuilt and became major centers of Islamic learning and culture. The Chagatai Khanate's patronage of Islamic scholarship produced some of the greatest works of medieval Islamic literature and science. The astronomical observations conducted at Samarkand under the patronage of Ulugh Beg, a descendant of Tamerlane and great-great-grandson of Genghis Khan, were among the most accurate of their time and contributed significantly to the development of astronomy. The Mughal Empire in India, established by Babur in the 16th century, represented perhaps the most successful long-term adaptation of Mongol traditions to a sedentary environment. Babur claimed descent from both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, and the empire he founded combined Mongol military traditions with Persian administrative practices and Indian cultural elements. The Mughal emperors maintained many of the characteristics that had made the original Mongol Empire successful. They practiced religious tolerance, promoted trade and cultural exchange, and maintained efficient administrative systems based on merit rather than birth. The greatest of the Mughal emperors, Akbar, exemplified these traditions in his attempts to create a syncretic religion that would unite all his subjects, and in his patronage of art and learning that drew from all the cultures of his empire. The architectural achievements of the Mughal Empire, including the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort, demonstrated the continuing vitality of the artistic synthesis that had begun under the original Mongol Empire. These buildings combined Islamic, Persian, and Indian design elements in ways that created entirely new forms of architectural expression. The economic policies of the Mughal Empire also reflected the Mongol legacy. The empire's emphasis on promoting trade and maintaining efficient transportation networks recalled the commercial policies of the original Mongol Empire. The Grand Trunk Road, which connected Calcutta to Kabul, facilitated trade and communication across the subcontinent in ways that echoed the Mongol achievement in creating transcontinental trade routes. The intellectual achievements of the Mughal period also reflected the Mongol tradition of cultural synthesis. The court of Akbar attracted scholars and artists from across the Islamic world, creating an environment of intellectual exchange that recalled the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Karakorum. The historical works produced during this period, including the Akbarnama and the Ain-i-Akbari, continued the Mongol tradition of comprehensive record-keeping and scholarly investigation. The decline of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century marked the end of the last great state that could claim direct descent from Genghis Khan's empire. Yet the influence of Mongol traditions continued to be felt throughout the regions that had once been part of the great empire. The administrative systems, legal traditions, and cultural practices that had been developed under Mongol rule provided foundations for the development of modern states across Eurasia. The memory of the Mongol Empire lived on in the folk traditions and historical consciousness of the peoples who had experienced Mongol rule. In China, the Mongols were remembered as the Yuan dynasty, one of the great dynasties in Chinese history. The Chinese historical tradition with its emphasis on the mandate of heaven, interpreted Mongol rule as a legitimate phase in the cyclical rise and fall of dynasties that characterize Chinese political development. In Persia, the Mongols were remembered as the Ilkhans, patrons of art and architecture, who had contributed to the flowering of Persian Islamic civilization. Persian historical writers, following the tradition established by Rashid al-Din, recognized the Mongol period as a time of cultural synthesis and intellectual achievement that had enriched Persian civilization. In Russia, the Mongols were remembered as the Golden Horde, whose influence had shaped Russian political and cultural development for centuries. The Russian historical tradition acknowledged the role of Mongol rule in creating the administrative and military structures that would later be used by the Russian Empire. The concept of autocratic rule, which became central to Russian political tradition, owed much to the Mongol example. The scholarly study of the Mongol Empire, which began in earnest in the modern period, revealed the true extent of their achievements and their impact on world history. Far from being mere destroyers, the Mongols were shown to be sophisticated rulers who created institutions and policies that were remarkably advanced for their time. The empire's emphasis on religious tolerance, cultural exchange, and merit-based advancement anticipated many of the values that modern societies hold dear. Archaeological evidence of Mongol rule continues to emerge, revealing new aspects of their impact on the regions they governed. Excavations at Karakoram have uncovered evidence of the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol society, with artifacts from across Eurasia found in the same archaeological layers. These discoveries have helped to correct earlier misconceptions about the Mongols and to present a more balanced view of their historical role. Recent discoveries at other Mongol sites have revealed the sophistication of their urban planning and architectural achievements. The city of Karakoram, for example, was found to have had a complex system of water management and waste disposal that was advanced for its time. The palace complex at the center of the city showed influences from Chinese, Persian, and European architectural traditions, demonstrating the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol court culture. The linguistic legacy of the Mongol Empire can be seen in the many languages that borrowed Mongol words and concepts. Terms related to governance, military organization, and trade entered the vocabularies of Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Russian, and many other languages. These linguistic borrowings are evidence of the deep influence that Mongol culture had on the societies they ruled and continue to influence today. In Chinese, words related to postal systems, military organization, and administrative procedures reflect Mongol influence. The Chinese word for passport, for example, derives from a Mongol term, reflecting the Mongols' role in developing the first systematic international travel documentation. Similarly, many Chinese terms related to mathematics and astronomy reflect the influence of the Islamic scholars who worked in Mongol courts. Persian contains even more extensive Mongol linguistic influences, reflecting the longer period of Mongol rule in that region. Words related to government, military affairs, and court ceremonial all show Mongol influence. The Persian historical tradition also preserves many Mongol administrative terms that provide insights into the functioning of the Mongol governmental system. Russian preserves linguistic evidence of the Golden Horde period in words related to taxation, administration, and trade. Many of these terms entered Russian through Tatar, reflecting the Turkicization of the Golden Horde, but they ultimately derive from Mongol sources. The Russian postal system, for example, preserves the Mongol term yam in modified form, demonstrating the continuity of Mongol administrative practices. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire is still visible today, with genetic studies showing that millions of people across Eurasia carry genetic markers associated with Mongol ancestry. This biological legacy is testimony to the empire's vast reach and the movement of peoples that it facilitated. The genetic evidence suggests that the Mongol Empire created the first truly global population exchange, with genetic influences spreading from East Asia to Eastern Europe. Recent genetic studies have revealed that the genetic impact of the Mongol Empire was not limited to the ruling elites, but extended throughout the populations of the regions they controlled. This suggests that the Mongol Empire facilitated extensive population movements and cultural exchange that went far beyond the political and military spheres. The empire created opportunities for ordinary people to travel and settle across vast distances, contributing to the genetic and cultural mixing that characterizes modern Eurasian populations. The environmental legacy of the Mongol Empire was also significant, though often overlooked in historical accounts. The empire's policies led to reforestation in some areas, as agricultural land was abandoned and returned to nature. In other regions, the disruption of traditional land management practices had negative environmental consequences. The Mongols' own lifestyle, based on sustainable nomadic practices, offered lessons about living in harmony with the natural environment that remain relevant today. The Mongol Empire's impact on climate and environment was complex and varied across different regions. In some areas, the reduction in agricultural activity following Mongol conquest led to carbon sequestration as forests regrew. Some modern climate scientists have suggested that this reforestation may have contributed to the cooling climate of the late medieval period, though this remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance, based on pragmatism rather than rigid ideology, offers lessons for modern leaders facing the challenges of governing diverse populations. The Mongols' willingness to adapt their methods to local conditions and to learn from the peoples they conquered demonstrates the importance of flexibility and openness in effective leadership. Their emphasis on merit over birth in selecting officials provides a model for creating fair and efficient administrative systems. The Mongol Empire's economic policies also provide insights relevant to modern global commerce. Their emphasis on protecting merchants and maintaining secure trade routes created the conditions for economic growth that benefited all participants in the system. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire facilitated commerce in ways that anticipate modern efforts at economic integration. The Mongol Empire's approach to cultural and religious diversity remains relevant in an increasingly globalized world. Their policies of tolerance and inclusion created stable, prosperous societies from diverse populations. The empire's success in managing cultural diversity while maintaining political unity offers lessons for modern multicultural societies struggling with similar challenges. As you rest in the deepest tranquility of night, let your final thoughts embrace the extraordinary scope of human achievement that the Mongol Empire represents. From the windswept steppes where it began to the farthest reaches of the known world where it extended its influence, the empire demonstrated humanity's capacity for organization, adaptation, and cultural synthesis on the grandest scale imaginable. The story of the Mongol Empire is ultimately a story of transformation, not just the transformation of the political map of Eurasia, but the transformation of human consciousness about what was possible in terms of governance, cultural exchange, and peaceful coexistence among diverse peoples. The empire showed that the barriers that seemed to separate different civilizations were not insurmountable, and that human societies could benefit tremendously from contact and exchange with others. The legacy of Genghis Khan and his successors lives on not just in the historical record, but in the very fabric of modern Eurasian civilization. The cities they built, the trade routes they established, the administrative systems they created, and the cultural syntheses they fostered all contributed to the development of the modern world. The Mongol Empire's vision of a unified world under just and tolerant governance remains an inspiration for those who work toward international cooperation and understanding. In the silence of the deep night, under the same stars that once guided Mongol armies across the vastness of Eurasia, the greatest empire in human history rests eternal. Its physical power has long since passed into memory, but its achievements in demonstrating the possibilities of human cooperation and cultural synthesis continue to inspire and guide us toward a better understanding of our shared humanity. The wind that still blows across the steppes carries with it the whispers of that ancient greatness, reminding us that even from the humblest beginnings, extraordinary things are possible when vision, courage, and wisdom combine to shape the destiny of the world.